Welcome to my home. Today we're going to be studying Mosiah, chapters 7 through 10. We're going to be looking specifically at peacemakers, community, and deliverance from bondage. Welcome to Grounded, where women of all ages, nationalities, and backgrounds gather together with me, Barbara Morgan Gardner, and my guests, as we strive to gain a bedrock understanding of the life and teachings of Jesus Christ and become more like Him. Today we are joined by our wonderful friend, Ava Witesman. Ava, thank you so much for being here today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Ava, President Nelson has reminded us that we are all children of God, children of the covenant, and disciples of Christ. Beyond those identities, which are so important, how would you introduce yourself to our audience, to our friends?
Yeah. So I actually think about those three identities a lot. And I think one of the things that's really important and interesting about them is that the first one is one that is sort of a natural characteristic. Like, we don't choose to be children of God. We just are, right? And the other ones are ones that we choose by covenant. And so one of the other ways that I would introduce myself is as a mother, but I actually think of that also as like an eternal identity and not necessarily related to the fact that I'm also a parent in mortality. So like, I would introduce myself also as a woman and as a mother. And then other ways that I would introduce myself sort of by choice, or things that I do, are that I am a mother of 4 children that I get to raise here on earth. I have another 3 that I'm looking forward to meeting someday in the eternities. And I also work at BYU, and there I'm a professor. I teach government management, nonprofit management, and pro-social business. And I also direct the Ballard Center for Social Impact.
Thank you. Ava, when we look at these scriptures, Mosiah chapter 7 through 10, there's a lot going on here, and especially with your professional background and your just experience in scriptures and life, and as a woman, there's so much that we can be learning, that you can be guiding us through. And I'd like to really start with what it means to be a peacemaker, and kind of looking at peacemaking in these scriptures. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
So just to start, we have a quote by President Nelson, and he says, "You have your agency to choose contention or reconciliation." And then he says, "I urge you to choose to be a peacemaker now and always."
Yeah.
So with that introduction, will you just run with us for a little bit?
Absolutely. So I think a lot of times when we think about kind of the middle part of the Book of Mormon, we think about like the war chapters, and we think about all of the conflict. And I think one of the cool things about these chapters is that you can also find hints about how to create peace and how to choose peace. So when we start out in these chapters, right from the beginning, chapter 7, we've got Ammon finding the land of Lehi, Nephi, and he's immediately put into bondage, right? It's like, you are a foreigner, put you in bondage, right? And here he is before King Limhi, and we sort of start with this point of conflict. And then in verse 13, he says, "For I am assured that if ye had known me, ye would not have suffered that I should have worn these bands." So if you had known me, if you had known who I am, right? I am your brother. Yes, I'm not from your community. I'm not, from here, but we are brothers. And sure enough, right, King Limhi discovers that they're brothers, and that these are sort of long lost siblings, right, from now another community, but that they finally found each other. And I love that idea of like reconciliation across what we might perceive to be divides. And understanding like that siblinghood, that relationship that we have because we're children of God, is, I think, such a key to peacemaking. So that's the first thing that really struck me as like a note on how to be peacemakers.
I love that idea of if you had known me. I mean, how many times have we considered somebody completely different than us, or even at odds, but then we go to lunch with them, or we invite them into our home, and within moments, we become the dearest of friends, or at least we see that we have so much more in common than we thought before.
The easy thing, like our brains sort of want to protect us. And so our brains want to help us identify differences because those differences might be dangerous to us. Like, that's how we tend to perceive differences. And so we have to make the choice to be peacemakers and to actively say, I am going to look for the commonality. I'm going to look for the way that you're my brother or that you're my sister. And I'm going to look for the good in you when maybe, the world suggests that I should be there to fight or to defend or to protect. And so I love that we gain that from the scriptures. So in the scriptures, we talked about brotherhood, and I think it's just because the characters in the stories are brothers, and so that's how they're referring to it. But I also think there's this powerful sisterhood that we have, not just as like members of the Relief Society or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but also just the experiences of women that are unique in the world, and that also kind of bind us and bond us to one another at a really core level, where it's like, there are things I understand about your experience as a woman because I too am a woman, and because we are, you know, roughly half the population around the world, it creates this automatic sense of potential community and sisterhood, where even, you know, little things, biological things even, that many or most of us have, that creates this like common language or common understanding, I think can be a real platform for peacemaking across the world, because we have these connections with each other that that are unique to womanhood.
You know, I think about some of the negative context of women too, and I think about like backbiting, or I think about gossiping and things like that. So it's just a question from what you have perceived in your life, both professionally at church and at home. How can women be better peacemakers in communities, in churches, in the home? What can you see that women can do? I mean, of course, this is for everyone, but I'm, you know, it's interesting in talking about women in this perspective.
Yeah.
So what do you see, Ava?
Well, so one of the things that I think about is like what might be one of the roots of that behavior. What makes someone feel like they might need to put someone else down, right? And a lot of times I think it's the power structures that we find ourselves in make us feel powerless. And so we're sort of grasping at whatever might make us feel like we have some sort of power. And I want to distinguish now, I'm talking about power over others. And we find ourselves in power situations where people have power over us in ways that feel uncomfortable. But I think one of the things that we can do to be peacemakers and to also kind of leverage this opportunity to come together in communities is to change the way we think about power. There are other ways like power to, which is the power to accomplish things, to do things. And because of the covenants that we make, we have the power to do God's work, which is incredible. To have, you know, the power and authority of the priesthood through our covenants is incredible. So if we can shift our focus from power over structures where we feel disempowered and move to a power to, the other is power with.
So let me get this right. Power over, power to, power with.
Exactly.
This is great.
Yeah. So the idea of power with is that you don't have to have one person be dominant over another or one culture be dominant over another. You can have shared power. And one of the things that I love so much about the priesthood and the practice of it is that the number one responsibility of any person with the priesthood, particularly priesthood holders, so male priesthood holders, their number one responsibility is to get that priesthood power to as many people as possible. This is why we have missionaries. This is why we have baptism. This is the work of ordination, right?
Yeah.
Is to get that power to as many people as possible. A power over paradigm, power hoards, right? A power over paradigm says, I want to keep the power for myself and I want to prevent others from having it. The priesthood is the opposite of that. The priesthood is entirely, in fact, a priesthood holder is not really even in a position to use that priesthood to benefit himself. He can't ordain himself or give blessings to himself. It is all power to do God's work and to empower others to do God's work and invite them into it, power with. And so the power of covenants, we share that priesthood power. But I think the question that you asked was, you know, sometimes there are cultures of women that are sort of putting each other down.
Yeah.
I think it's because of the way that we think about power in the world and the way that we experience it. And so the answer to your question is, if we shift the way that we think about power, we're going to be less disempowered. We're going to feel less like we need to put other people down. And we're going to be much more focused on, how do I share the power that I have? And how do I use the power that I have to bless the lives of other people?
That's beautiful, Ava. Way to go.
But it comes back also to peacemaking.
How?
Because this idea of power with others, like that's how the priesthood is exercised. It's exercised in counsel.
Yeah.
It's exercised in collaboration, both with God and with each other. And you can't do that if you don't have peace. And it requires you to create peace when you have things like disagreements. In the talk that President Nelson gave on Peacemakers Needed, he specifically talks about how he wants people to disagree with him. He wants people to bring, all the information that they have that he may not have, so that together they can make the best possible decisions. So
can I read that quote really quick?
Yes,
because
please.
I love it.
Yeah.
It's right here. He
Yep.
says, my two noble counselors, President Dallin H. Oaks and President Henry B. Eyring, which I will just throw in there with you. These are brilliant men
yes,
who have very strong opinions, are extremely well educated, and have been around the block. I'm just going to throw that out.
yep,
So, are exemplary in the ways they express their feelings, especially when they may differ. They do so with pure love for each other. Neither suggests that he knows best and therefore must rigorously defend his position. Neither evidences the need to compete with the other. Because each is filled with charity, the pure love of Christ, our deliberations can be guided by the Spirit of the Lord. How I love and honor these two great men.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, to your point, these are brilliant men who have strong opinions,
Right.
and I'm confident they disagree.
yeah. And it goes back to the point you were making about like the temptations to sort of fight or backbite or
Yeah.
compete, right?
Yeah.
So he's talking about how like specifically that charitable understanding of the need to have peace allows for that conflict without contention, right? Those two
Excellent.
things are different.
Yeah, I remember talking with Reina Berta one time. We are just talking about leadership and counseling and things that we can learn about counseling. And she just simply said, one of the things that I've learned about being a peacemaker and working in councils is when I have a decision, it's my decision. But the moment I open my mouth in a council, whether it's with my husband, whether it's in church calling, general authority type thing, she says, the moment I put my idea on the table, it's no longer mine. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just so wise as we're talking about. We're not trying to get our ideas established. We're trying to counsel with each other so that we can know the will of the Lord. I mean, that's a church and family, but hopefully that's also what we're seeing in a greater perspective. And that's a peacemaking technique. That's a skill.
Finding truth, finding revelation.
Yep.
That's the goal.
Yeah.
Right? It's not about being the one or the right one or having more power. And I also think that this sort of ties in to an idea of like the difference between real peace and false peace. I think there are times in our lives where we experience things or think of things as peace that actually aren't. So, for example, an absence of conflict doesn't necessarily denote peace.
Yes.
And an absence of feelings or hurt doesn't actually denote peace. Sometimes we've just gone numb, right? Sometimes we haven't worked all the way through something and worked through to find a peace with someone, things like forgiveness, right? So just numbing ourselves out and choosing not to feel things, or keeping our tongue and not saying our opinion or a way that we might see things differently from someone isn't actually real peace. It's a false peace. And a real peace requires coming together, recognizing the differences, in some cases recognizing the hurt and the pain and talking it through and working it through. And Ammon does that with King Limhi, right? He says, look, if you had known who I was, you would not have put me in bondage. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about who I am and who you are. Let's build peace. Let's have this conversation about how we're brothers, and let's share our different experiences and how we came to this point together, to this conflict. And maybe by sharing our perspectives, we can create a peace with one another. And I love that lesson from the scriptures.
And Limhi could have just said, you know what? I don't really care who you are. I just know that you're coming in to hurt my people, and I'm just going to put a wall up, and we're not going to have that discussion. Right. But thank you, you're dead. Right. And that he really could have done that. Right. But so in a sense, good job to King Limhi too for taking the time to slow down and say, wait a second, what? President Nelson, maybe to finish off this segment before we jump into the next, I thought this was interesting as well, and maybe you can just, I'll read the quote and then you guide us through this. He says, "Now I am not talking about peace at any price. I am talking about treating others in ways that are consistent with keeping the covenant you make when you partake of the sacrament. You covenant to always remember the Savior in situations that are highly charged and filled with contention. I invite you to remember Jesus Christ. Pray to have the courage and the wisdom to say or do what he would. As we follow the Prince of Peace, we will become his peacemakers." So I just want to leave that quote. Any final thoughts you have on that as far as we're talking about peacemakers in this section?
I think my final thought is simply that this entire talk should be something that we return to regularly. Peacemakers Needed by President Nelson. I would invite just everyone to go back to this regularly. I think this is the most beautiful treatise on how to create peace personally, how to create it in our families and homes, how to create it at work, how to create it in our communities and world. So we'll leave the last word as his.
Thank you. Okay, let's go on to our next topic.
Yes.
You ready? The next topic is community, another
So ready.
area that you have a lot of
Yeah.
experience in. So let's talk community. We have these people now that are coming from all these varieties of places, and they're all kind of unifying back together.
Yeah.
Can you take it from there? Teach us about community.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to sort of talk about why I've started thinking a lot about community. I think about community a lot at work.
Yeah.
Through nonprofit work and government work. A lot of the work of those organizations is to try to create and maintain healthy communities. But I've actually found sort of a new enthusiasm for it since trying to help my children understand why we go to church. And
That's really good, Ava.
well, it
is.
I mean, it's
necessarily.
right. No, it's been a powerful concept because it's not just that we're there to individually worship or to gain from the opportunity. Community, in my view, is something that doesn't exist until people show up to participate in it. So if you think about like a farmer's market, it would be nothing. It would literally be nothing if people didn't show up to buy things or people didn't show up to sell things. And yet it's one of the cool remnants of sort of an old style community that we used to have, where we were much more in each other's space and in each other's lives, in marketplaces, in community sports, in all kinds of ways that we've traditionally sort of come together to do things together. Several years ago, Robert Putnam wrote this book called Bowling Alone, where he basically talks about the erosion of particularly American community that he said was evidenced in part by the decline of bowling leagues. I mean, there are other things too.
Yeah.
So there's sort of this decline in coming together in public spaces, and that has made me think a lot about like, what is the value of being in those public spaces? What does community mean? Whether it's a ward activity, whether it's, something that the city or state is putting on, it only works when people show up. And they don't have to show up and like lift heavy burdens necessarily. They just, by showing up, they actually create a sense of community and a sense of belonging with each other. And, we came here from talking about peacemaking. Community building is an opportunity to allow conversations that create an opportunity to create peace. And there are some things that King Limhi does in chapter 7 that I think are a great example of how we can build community. So one of my favorite things that he does is right after discovering who Ammon actually is. This is verse 14. He says, "And now I will rejoice, and on the morrow I will cause that my people shall rejoice also." And it's like, we have a community. I mean, for your king to be able to say, tomorrow we're going to throw a big party and we're going to all celebrate together, this reunion of our peoples, indicates that they have this sense of community, that he can invite people and they will come, and that he can invite them to celebrate and they will celebrate. And I think sometimes we are so focused on like work or the things that need to be achieved, or the, all the chores that need to be done at home, like all of these outcomes of what looks like a perfect life, whether at home or at work or in the community, that we forget to step back and like celebrate, to do fun things together. The Proclamation on the Family actually talks about like wholesome recreational activities,
Absolutely.
right?
Yep.
That these things that I think sometimes in our hustle bustle world, we think of as superfluous and we think of as not important. And so we fill our whole lives with the work of home and the work of the marketplace, that there's not room for celebration. We actually learn from King Limhi that we need to celebrate together, and that's part of creating community.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were saying that, the different kinds of gatherings that we see throughout the scriptures. I mean, and especially the joyful gatherings. The woman who has lost the coin, she's looking everywhere. And what does she do? She brings everyone to celebrate.
Right.
You think of the prodigal son and his returning, and the father brings everyone together. Big party,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you think of just general conference and people coming for general conference.
Yeah.
And it has become in many people's homes and around the world, it's a party. I mean, they want this.
Yeah.
And that's not to say everyone is. Sometimes and that's one of the more difficult things, is loneliness has set in as well, as what kind of you're discussing there.
Yeah.
But it's this element of, in creating community and people, to bring people together. We want people to be gathering and being a part to create that.
Right. And gathering is actually a principle of the gospel too, right?
Yeah. Oh,
the gathering of
absolutely.
Israel
Yes.
is just one example of that. But like gathering to meet that principle of gathering. And we see, especially post-COVID, where we sort of couldn't gather for a while, that we discovered sort of in the absence of gathering, how important gathering actually is. And in the absence of community, how important community actually is. And so I think part of the invitation here through the example of King Limhi is the invitation to intentionally create communities. And one way to do that is celebrating together.
And you can see this almost, we're talking about this gathering here in the gathering of Israel, but this eternal gathering.
Yeah.
And it's not just saying when you send somebody, it's you go find that person and bring them with you, and then together we are going to have this great joy.
Right.
It's that relationship of building a community.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Come unto Christ and don't come alone.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I throw one more area out at you? Because I know you know something about this too. So in verse 20 of chapter 8, speaking of community again, we hear this statement. So this is Am, and he's speaking to the people.
Yep.
Besides being grateful, which he does in verse 19, and greater the mysteries of God. Verse 20, he says, how marvelous are the works of the Lord. How long doth he suffer with his people? Yea, and how blind and impenetrable are the understandings of the children of men. And then there's this part. For they will not seek wisdom, neither do they desire that she should rule over them. Yeah. And then you see in the scriptures this footnote, little b in verse 20, and it takes you down and you see
who is she?
Yes, exactly. And it says wisdom, a feminine noun in Hebrew and Greek. Yeah. Okay, what do you think?
Well, so the first thing that I actually think is about the tree of knowledge.
Yeah.
Right? I go all the way back to Eve and her choice in Eden. To choose knowledge because it was necessary for us to have that knowledge to become godlike, to make the plan work. And so I love that. And it also makes me think about other really gendered verbs in the scriptures. And one of the other ones that feels really prominent to me is that the term Zion. So we're talking about community, right?
Yeah.
The term Zion tends to be a feminine noun, I guess, in this case.
Yeah.
Throughout the scriptures, and Israel tends to be a masculine noun, but both of those involve gathering, both of those involve community. And I think it's really interesting to look at those little pieces, both as evidence of like the Hebraic origins of the language that's being used here. I think that's a beautiful evidence, but also it makes me think about Zion a little bit differently when I think about a work of women in gathering the world.
Absolutely. And you just reminded me of two incredibly important talks. One is it just might be a lot of really important talks, but one is President Eyring, where he's talking about women and the work of building Zion. Yes. And he says, women, you have a very unique and important responsibility to create Zion. And then he talks about characteristics of women and why that is the case. It also reminds me of President Nelson talking about the great courage and vision, and in the way he's describing it, the wisdom of Mother Eve. Yes. And as we later on see, the glorious Mother Eve that we describe.
Right.
Then you also remind me of President Nelson's incredible talk on women's responsibility in the gathering of Israel.
Yep.
Right? I mean, we cannot
these are not
have a
independent
gathering.
works.
No, these are all, there's a reason he's bringing women into there.
Yeah.
And he says in there, we cannot gather Israel without you.
Right.
I mean, and so the important role of women and men working together.
And we can't build Zion without men.
Exactly.
Right?
That's the critical point here.
It's the same work. Right.
I believe that one of the things that Satan would love to do, and you see it happening here because you see Laman doing this, is he's trying to make people fight within a community, right? He's forcing them into an uncomfortable situation and making, again, what you were talking about earlier with peacemaking, he's putting people over other people.
Yes.
And that is one of the things that Satan is trying to do with gender issues, I believe, today, is he's trying to, there's always this comparison and who's more important and who's less important and who's making decisions and who's not making decisions, all of those things. But if what we're trying to do with God here and what it seems like he's trying to do with creating Zion is he's putting us all, as a Savior does, every soul is important to the Lord, and it's the synergy and the unity that we see that is going to create Zion, not the separate people working on their own. We cannot create Zion if people are not willing to gather.
Absolutely.
Right?
Well,
and women are essential to that.
They absolutely are.
And men are too.
Yes, they are. And I think one of the things that Satan does so sneakily and so well is to make it seem like what power is power over others. Right.
So well said.
And if you listen to when people talk about power, you can tell what kind of power they're talking about. And most of the time, what they're referring to is power over rather than power with or power to. And so if he can distract us by saying, look at these hierarchies, right? Look at the inequities and inequalities. Now, like, some of that absolutely needs to be remedied.
100%. I don't want to minimize
Yeah,
that either,
no,
because
absolutely
that's also
not.
extremely important.
I also deeply in the core of my being believe that priesthood is the antidote to patriarchy.
100% agree with that.
It's a completely different power structure, and using the language of the world for and applying it, that power over, is a false way of thinking about what that power actually is and what it's meant for and the way that it's exercised.
When we truly understand the priesthood, the patriarchal order is kind of what we talked about. And sometimes that has a very demeaning, but there's a difference, and we won't get into it right now, between patriarchal versus patriarchy.
Right.
That's
right,
a huge distinction.
Yes, for sure.
When we understand that the highest order, the Melchizedek priesthood, is what brings husband and wife and women and men in a position where they are helping and working with and power with each other.
Right.
Then there's synergy, then there's potential gods and goddesses, queens and queens, everlasting joy and eternity. But when we switch that, or we allow the world to switch that, that's when we lose it. And I want to make it very clear, it does happen. We're not saying it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But it's really, when you see, especially Old Testament, what was the problem with Esther? Not that Esther had a problem, but the problem was with Vashti. The problem is Vashti is being asked to dance in front of the king, in front of all of his friends, and she's saying, no, I'm not going to do that. To me, that's absolutely incredible, because why? They are no longer living the patriarchal order or the new and everlasting covenant or the highest order of the priesthood. And so what do we do to empower women, and how do we empower communities? We live our covenants. Any last thoughts that you'd like to share as far as community and building community before we move on to the next topic?
I think the idea of contributing to a community is important. So one of the things that King Limhi talks about as he's sort of telling the tale of his people and how they came into bondage, is that he talks about the taxes that are exacted of his people, about half of everything that they produce. Right? We were talking about like a community being this amazing, beautiful thing where people are producing things together. They're working shoulder to shoulder, right? They're trading among themselves. And then they have this external force that comes and is essentially stealing from them, right?
Yeah.
And they term it taxes. But I think that term means something a little different.
Yeah, that
to most of us
external
today,
thing is
right?
what's happening.
It's so they're taking away all this work. But if you look at that and you think about, well, what were they doing that felt peaceful to them and was building their community? And it was that they were not only growing these things to benefit themselves, but they also were contributing to their community.
Yeah.
And so especially when we see a word like taxes, I want us to just sort of, and again, this is my government training coming in, right? Like
Perfect. Thank you.
I want to think about this, that we have the privilege, especially in democratic societies, and we know that that at least the king in this case was appointed by the voice of the people. So we know that this is at least to some extent a democratic society, right? And that there's a privilege associated with that, where the people can choose for themselves to contribute back to their community some proportion of what they have worked for or gained back to the benefit of the community that continues to help sustain them. And I think in the church, we see things like tithing and fast offerings. And if we're fully living our covenants, we understand that consecration suggests that not only are we giving some part of things back to like the church, but we're actually giving everything back to God. And what does that actually look like? If you look at the early saints as they were trying to live a Zion society, that actually looked like in some circumstances them deeding everything over to the church and then stewarding some part of that for their own well-being and for the benefit of their community. So I want to just draw that distinction between having half of everything you've worked for stolen versus having the privilege in a democratic society of choosing together with, the rest of your, co-community members, choosing to agree to share of your abundance to make sure that there are no poor among you, to help uplift the community and one another, to pay for things like roads and schools and the things that we consider as like real privileges of our society today. So I wanted to just, as we're talking about communities, I think that's an important piece of it. And I can't talk about like community or communities without thinking about Elder Christofferson's talk about sustainable communities.
Yeah.
Where he really explores the idea of like what is necessary to make communities beautiful and sustainable. And he talks both about the contributions and the ways that we share and show up for each other. And then he also talks about how a truly sustainable community lives these covenants. And I think especially about the baptismal covenant, right, where we promise to sort of succor and support one another, to love our neighbor, to live those commandments. And then also our temple covenants that invite us to focus on that gathering and that building of the community of God through consecration. So not getting super attached to all of these, the flocks and the crops and the wealth and all of that, right? That is, as we see in the pride cycles throughout the Book of Mormon, like that's when you start thinking that's an end of itself and that we want to be like preserving and keeping all the things that we've worked so hard for without sharing it back into our community. We're actually tipping over into the not so great side of the pride cycle where we forget God.
Well, it's a little bit President Eyring in this last in the April 2024 General Conference, where he says that when he was being sealed to his wife, he and his wife were being sealed together in a temple. He was given that by President Kimball. He was given the admonition, in a sense, to make sure you can always walk away. And I think that's kind of what you're describing there a little bit, is we're not so attached to it that we can't walk away, but we really are. Right. He's a consecrated individual in that covenant. He could walk away at any moment and serve the Lord. Yeah. He already was. I think the other important and extremely important part of what you're talking about there is in consecration, it is agency. It's all about choice and agency. Right. No one's forcing you to be a part of this community of consecrated people. Right. As opposed to other cultures and other government systems and things of that nature where somebody is actually forced into doing it. And this is the case with, we're seeing King Layman is forcing this,
taking
upon
it
the
from
people.
them. Yes.
Yeah. In the case that you're discussing as far as building community, it's when agency is used to build a community, then the community is strengthened.
Exactly. Right? And there are different ways that might look.
Yeah. And frankly, I'll throw that out as a family as well. Sometimes, as parents, I know with me, sometimes I can just really pound. And there is a moment where you say, Joseph Smith teaches this often. I mean, we use this quote by Joseph Smith often. He probably didn't teach it often. But it's that we teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves. Yes. And it's important that we teach the correct principles first, that our children and those that we have stewardship over understand these principles. But then we really do let them govern themselves. And we try to create this sustainable society of young people and youth as they're growing up so that they really can be responsible. Yeah. And they can make these agency choices to build a community.
Right. And that, like you're saying, like that community may also be the community of your family. Like, like just taking care of yourself is not sufficient. Like we make meals together and we share communal meals and we clean up together our shared space, right? Yes. Recognizing that you're a part of that little micro community and that requires the things that building communities always do.
Roommates, neighbors, all those people, right?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you, Ava. That was really a great discussion. Let's go to our next discussion then, as we start this, and that is the topic of deliverance from bondage. Yeah. Can you just guide us through that?
Yeah.
Help us understand a little bit and how important that is in these sets of scriptures here.
Absolutely. So for me, chapter 7, verse 33, he says, if you will turn to the Lord with full purpose of heart and put your trust in him and serve him with all diligence of mind, if you do this, he will, according to his own will and pleasure, deliver you out of bondage. And he's actually talking about two different sources of bondage throughout chapter 7 as he's telling the history of his people with the Lamanites. This is King Limhi talking about this. There are two kinds of bondage that he talks about. He talks about the bondage because of other people's agency, in this case, the Lamanites, who would put his people into bondage. And there's a second kind of bondage, which is the bondage that they put themselves into when they lose their way and they stop paying attention to Christ and they stop paying attention to God and his commandments. And in either case, I just want to come back to this idea that we can be delivered from bondage through the power of Jesus Christ and specifically through his atonement. In my life, there have been times where I have experienced extreme sadness, sorrow, and pain at the hands of other people.
Yeah.
And those other people aren't who I need to look to be freed from that pain. Who I need to look to be freed from that pain is Jesus Christ. And there are also times in my life where I've made really stupid decisions, right? Where I have left the path that I should have been on. And again, I'm not going to rescue myself from those poor choices. I have to turn to Jesus Christ. And when I do that, when I allow him to be my Redeemer, then I am freed from bondage. However I got into that bondage, he is the one who can free me. And I love that comes out here in verse 33.
I'm going to share with you one of my favorite scriptures. It's one that Elder Bednar has used on a number of occasions. He actually has a great talk called In the Strength of the Lord that he gave at a BYU Fireside, and I think BYU Idaho Fireside as well. But he quotes this scripture often, and the scripture is, so again, this is our third topic today, is deliverance from bondage.
Yes.
His scripture is in Mosiah chapter 9, verse 17, and he says, "Yea, in the strength of the Lord, we did go forth to battle against the Lamanites. For I and my people did cry mightily to the Lord, that he would deliver us out of the hands of our enemies. For we were awakened to remembrance of the deliverance of our father." And then I love verse 18, "And God did hear our cries, and did answer our prayers, and we did go forth in his might. Yea, we did go forth." I love that. It's the strength of the Lord going forth in his might.
Yes.
He is the powerful. He is the one who endows them with this incredible power as they were crying unto him.
Right.
Okay, let's take it, friend.
Well, and there's also actually a contrast to that in the same set of scriptures in chapter 10, verse 11. "Now the Lamanites knew nothing concerning the Lord, nor the strength of the Lord. Therefore they depended on their own strength. They were a strong people as to the strength of men." And so I love those two verses in contrast to each other, because on the one hand, it's like, okay, we're gonna gather together in the strength of the Lord. And then here are other people who are also gathering together, but without the strength of the Lord. And so what the difference between these two is the power of covenants and the power of having the Lord with them on their side, right? And one thing that I might say is if both sides had the Lord on their side, there wouldn't be a conflict, because that is
Great point. Yes.
That is the Lord's purpose,
Yes.
right? And so sometimes you have to sort of defend against what isn't the Lord's side, right?
I think it reminds me. I can't remember when it was at a BYU devotional. One of the Catholic, a Catholic leader came in and he was speaking about BYU playing Notre Dame, and he was talking about the football game. And I remember thinking, who's on the Lord's side? Who really? Like, and whose side is the Lord on? Like, whose prayers are going to win this game tonight?
And
I mean, it sounds silly,
conflict, but
yes.
not contention.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Like, can we?
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that's actually a great example, because if both, like, they do have competition, right? But if both are truly on the Lord's side, we're going to keep the sports metaphor, right?
Yeah.
In the end, what is that sports event? It's not a war. It's a community gathering between two communities. And it's a joyful celebration of sports and athleticism, and the competition just sort of heightens the joy of it. But it's not, I hate the other team, right? It's we're both on the Lord's side. And the reason that we're coming together and having this fun, joyful conflict is actually to create a co-community with each other. And it's a really different way than like a tribalism, which would say us versus them, and being taught to hate. Which is one of the other things that we see in chapter 10, where it says, "And thus they have taught their children that they should hate them, and they should murder them, and they should rob and plunder them, and do all they could to destroy them. Therefore they have an eternal hatred toward the children of Nephi." Like, this is one of the things that we really need to watch out for when we're talking about things like peacemaking and community building. Is there language, us versus them language, that we use, whether we're noticing it or not, that is teaching the people around us that they should hate them and murder them and rob them and plunder them, that's okay, or that it's deserved? Any us versus them kind of language is falling into this trap, and we need to avoid it with everything we have.
In General Conference, I cannot remember who said it, but I think that was the important part of be careful of what you let yourself think about people, because what you let yourself think will come out of your mouth at some point.
Right.
So if you don't let yourself think that, you're great.
So Elder Christofferson has this talk called The Doctrine of Belonging, and
such a great talk.
It's such a great talk.
It is.
And he says, we cannot permit any racism, tribal prejudice, or other divisions to exist in the Latter-day Church of Christ. The Lord commands us, be one. And if ye are not one, ye are not mine. We should be diligent in rooting prejudice and discrimination out of the church, out of our homes, and most of all, out of our hearts.
I just want to read this quote from Elder Bednar. He says, "The enabling power of the atonement of Christ strengthens us to do things we could never do on our own. Sometimes I wonder if in our latter-day world of ease, and our world of microwave ovens and cell phones and air-conditioned cars and comfortable homes, I wonder if we ever learn to acknowledge our daily dependence upon the enabling power of the atonement." And then he continues, and this is kind of a bring it home lesson. He says, "The greatest lesson I have learned about the enabling power have come from the quiet example of my wife in our own home. I watched her persevere through intense and continuous morning sickness and vomiting during each of her 3 pregnancies. She literally was sick all day, every day for 8 months with each pregnancy. That challenge was never removed from her. But together we prayed that she would be strengthened, and she indeed was blessed through the enabling power of the atonement to do physically what in her own power she could not do. Then he continues, Sister Bednar is a remarkably capable and competent woman. And over the years, I have seen how she has been magnified to handle the mocking and the scorn that have come from a secular society when a Latter-day Saint woman heeds prophetic counsel and makes family and home and nurturing of children her highest priority. In today's world, a righteous woman and mother in Zion will need both priestess support and the enabling power of the atonement. I thank and pay tribute to Susan for helping me to learn such invaluable lessons. I want to share with this, as both of us are professors and at our home, in our responsibility, and you tell me if this is the case with you, in our responsibility as a professor and in the many things that we are called upon to do, I think as women, we still see our primary responsibility as nurturers in the home, for children, for people, wherever we are. I mean, Eve was a mother, and you mentioned this at the beginning, before she had children. It's not just the children necessarily in the home, but as women, we have a divine responsibility to be helping people come into Christ in whatever capacity that is, according to the measure of the creation that God has given to us. So each of us are by needing the enabling power of the atonement to do what it is that the Lord would have us do in this life.
Yeah. I truly believe that the role of motherhood is independent of, but of course complemented by the ability to bear and raise children or adopt and raise children.
Yeah, well said.
On earth, right? So I view my work and my calling in the world as expressions of my motherhood, not my parenthood, my eternal role as a mother. And so any work that I do, I mean, it's part of how I chose the disciplines that I'm in. This is why I study nonprofit work. It's why I advocate for positive social impact, is because it's part of why I teach, is because I am trying to uplift in the way that a mother does and think about all children. I mean, Eve was the mother of all living, and she was that before we came about, right? So it's this communal thinking. It's this for the benefit of others. It was not to her benefit to leave the Garden of Eden. It was not to her benefit to suddenly know good from evil and go through hardship, right?
Yeah.
Not her personal benefit, her eternal benefit. Yes, necessary, yes. But I think she chose that as a service to all of humanity so that God's plan could be put into place, so that we could come here to become who we're meant to become, that we couldn't do otherwise. So as an extension of her as an exemplar, I do think that it goes deep beyond the kind of nurturing that we often think of like holding and comforting and feeding and caring for. I think it's sort of nurturing and this eternal sense of motherhood is a broad thinking about the big family, right? The family of God, the children of God, and the responsibilities that we have for that, which includes the types of humanitarian aid that we might do, or the work in our community that we might do, or the ministering that we might do inside and outside of our families.
So Ava, that has been a fantastic discussion on deliverance from bondage and tying in kind of the strength of the Lord with that. Thank you. Thank you for talking about peacemakers and community and deliverance from bondage. And thank you for tying in your life experiences and who you are as a woman and a grounded woman in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Ava, we typically finish with asking a simple question. It is, how has the Book of Mormon changed you? So just a brief answer off the top of your head. How has the Book of Mormon changed you?
The Book of Mormon has changed me by teaching me who Jesus Christ is and the power that he can have in my life. And that has made all the difference at every possible juncture in my life, turning to these words and hearing not only about his role in the Book of Mormon and who he is and what he teaches here and what he does here in his ministry, but also being able to hear his voice through the Spirit in Revelation. As I study the pages of this book, it has at every point in my life directed me so that I can be on a path where I am in the strength of the Lord.
Thank you, Ava. Beautiful. It is a book that changes our lives. So thank you for your testimony. We'd like to thank you as well for joining with us today on Grounded. We appreciate you coming into our home and being a part of this wonderful discussion. We invite you to continue to apply these principles of the gospel of Jesus Christ in your Lord as you seek to be grounded on the foundation of Jesus Christ. We also invite you to share this podcast with other people, help them to be a part of this great community, this gathering of women and men as we seek to bring in the second coming of Jesus Christ and become more like him. Thank you again for joining us on Grounded.